Chapter 22. Identity with Spirit. Statement. Spirit identifies itself with those of its characterizations which demonstrate their ability to consciously identity themselves with it. The conscious recognition of such identity by the intellect constitutes the perception of truth. The conscious realization of it by the intuition constitutes illumination. The conscious manifestation and demonstration of it by volition and ideation constitutes the mastery of being. The message of truth. In the above statement is announced the message of the perception of truth, of illumination, of the mastery of being. It is the highest message possible of delivery to man. In it is contained the gist and essence of all esoteric and occult teaching. Book after book may be written to elaborate and illustrate this truth, but the essence ever remains the same, for it is the very truth of truths. The perception of truth. In the preceding chapters we have sought to bring to the student the first stage of the conscious recognition of infinite identification, the conscious recognition by the intellect, which constitutes the perception of truth. To this end the axioms embodying the highest report of the reason have been presented to you, and you have been invited to make them your own. The practice and habitual employment of the axioms of reality will exercise and develop the intellect to the point where the absolute conscious recognition of spirit becomes a fact of your mental being. But the above statement mentions the existence of two succeeding stages, that of conscious realization by the intuition, and conscious manifestation and demonstration by volition and ideation. These are the stages of illumination and mastery, respectively. Let us now consider them. Intuition. The statement announces that the conscious realization of the identity with spirit by the intuition constitutes illumination. Let us pause a moment to consider what intuition is and how one may realize truth by means of it. Intuition is defined as direct apprehension or cognition, immediate knowledge, as in perception or consciousness involving no reasoning process, perception by the mind immediately and without the intervention of argument or testimony. The term was first used in the scholastic philosophy of many centuries ago, where it signified the means whereby man obtained a knowledge of God without the need of the reasoning faculties. It afterward passed into general philosophy, where it was used to indicate a supposed elemental knowledge of certain general facts and truths of the universe. In a closer usage it was employed to designate a supposed faculty of the mind, possessed by a favored few, which was superior to reason and which enabled its possessors to philosophize in a manner impossible to the common man who depended solely upon reason. Reason versus intuition. Modern philosophy, however, and modern psychology in particular, have been inclined to deny the validity of the so-called intuitive faculties of man. It is now generally held that the so-called intuitions are the products of evolution and heredity and are akin to race memory. In short, intuition is held to be identical with instinct. Innate ideas are denied upon the same grounds. The general philosophic thought of today holds that reason is the only source of knowledge possible to man, and echoes the words of Jami, the Sufi poet, and first with reason, which is also best reason that writes the wanderer, that completes the imperfect reason that resolves the knot of either world, and sees beyond the veil. For reason is the fountain spring of old from which the prophets drew, and none beside. Who boasts of other inspiration, lies there are no other prophets than the wise. Esoteric teaching. But in the occult and esoteric teaching of all ages there is ever found the insistent claim that man possesses certain faculties or powers of intuitive perception, not adapted to receiving reports of the objective world, but which may and do receive reports from one's own inner nature and being, which are impossible to the sense organs or the perception arising therefrom. Such teachings hold that man is able to turn his mental gaze inward, as well as outward, and thus to obtain reliable and valid reports of his own inner nature and being, which may afterward be considered by the reason and deductions made therefrom. As we have said, philosophy and science have frowned upon this idea and have declared it to be but vain imagining. But there has recently arisen in the philosophical firmament a new philosopher of the first magnitude, who positively asserts the existence of intuition in man and declares that there is a certain knowledge possible to man only through the exercise of intuition, the reason being unable to explore the field of such knowledge. This philosopher of the revolutionary idea is Henri Bergson, whose work is now attracting the attention of the world of philosophy. The New Philosophy. Bergson claims that truth is known to man only through the interaction of intellect and intuition. He claims that intellect informs us only regarding material things. Intuition informs us only regarding the inner nature and facts of life and being. He claims that the intellect is a nucleus formed by a contraction or narrowing of the power of consciousness, and that around it is a fringe of more comprehensive consciousness. In the latter the power of intuition lies. The intellect, he says, has been constructed by the evolutionary life forces to serve the practical purposes of the creatures possessing it, and that its very limitations add to its usefulness in its own particular field. Bergson insists that the intellect is neither supreme nor absolute, not even the only source of knowledge. Intuition is held not to be compared with the intellect so far as the practical knowledge of the objective world is concerned, our practical knowledge being almost entirely intellectual. But in its own field intuition far surpasses the intellect and gives us knowledge utterly unknown to the latter. Bergson, however, claims that, while the knowledge reported by intuition is perfect in its nature, it is limited in its scope. For, as he says, there are things that the intellect alone is able to seek but that by itself it will never find. Those things intuition alone can find but it will never seek them of itself. The something within. Schopenhauer, in advancing his conception of the world will, held that the intellect can never understand or know the will, the latter being more elemental than reason. He held, however, that the existence of the will as ultimate principle can be perceived in a unique way by turning the mental gaze inward. At the very center of being will be found the will, and its nature may be understood only by a study of its activities within ourselves. The Hindu philosophers have always held that the essence of being spirit may be perceived intuitively by turning inward the perceptive activities by the concentrated exercise of the will. The pages of the writings of the mystics are filled with instances of the conscious intuitive perception of union with God, or similar transcendental mental states. So common in the experience of the race is this mental phenomenon that it is everywhere recognized under the name of illumination. Mystic illumination. By illumination is meant the illumining or lighting up of the mind by an influx of new knowledge and perception. Those who have attained this stage of intuition have been known as the Illuminati, this title having been used by the Rosicrucians and other organizations of mystics. Illumination is generally held to be a strange, mystic experience or inrush of new knowledge. Such is the conception of the mystics, and such is the conception of the idea of cosmic consciousness of which so much has been heard during the past decade. This form of illumination has been common in all phases of religious thought and practice, and even outside of religious bodies. Many of the saints of all religions have recited instances of it while, on the other hand, men like Tennyson and Whitman have testified to similar experiences. The underlying experience common to all those relating the strange happening is that of a sudden sense of oneness with God or being. This sense of oneness has been variously interpreted by the members of the several religious beliefs favored by those experiencing it, but its universality takes it out from creed interpretation or sect possession and raises it to a much more exalted plane. Maurice Bucke, in his work on cosmic consciousness, claims that it is an inevitable result of the evolution of consciousness in the race, and that all the race eventually will experience it, although at present only a few advanced individuals know it in consciousness. He claims that just as mere sensation was succeeded by simple consciousness, and this later by self-consciousness, so will the latter be succeeded by this universal consciousness in which the individual is consciously identified with the all. Intellectual illumination. Apart from these instances of mystic experiences, many careful, conservative, thoughtful men of philosophic tendency and temperament have experienced a gradual unfoldment of some inner faculty of the mind which brought to them a consciousness of an identity with an underlying something which they found at the very center of their being, and which was recognized as being something far more elemental, fundamental, and real than the intellectual self or ego. This experience would seem to be analogous to that asserted by Schopenhauer, who asserted that the consciousness of the ego or I of each individual is in reality the consciousing of the point of connection or identity with the world will, or spirit. This experience is not the mystic, ecstatic union of religious devotees or poets, but rather the calm awareness of the philosophic temperament. And instead of being regarded by those experiencing it as a supernatural or transcendental happening, it is treated as a valid and natural report of some form of inner perception, and is then passed on to the reason for classification and deduction. Seeing and feeling. The statement makes the distinction between the recognition by the intellect and the realization by the intuition, the first resulting in the perception of truth and the latter in illumination. The distinction may well be considered in the terms of certain esoteric teachings in which the recognition by the intellect is considered as the seeing phase of perception, and the realization by the intuition as the feeling phase of the perception. The real, full, perfect, and complete knowledge of truth comes only from the combined report of intellect and intuition, the recognition joined to the realization. It is only when one both sees and feels the truth that he knows the truth. Seeing without the accompanying feeling is cold and unsatisfying, the intellect never satisfying the inner longing for truth, while feeling without the seeing is likewise unsatisfying, except perhaps to the poet or religious enthusiast, for the outraged intellect voices its disapproval and gives its own no peace. It is only when the intuition and intellect join hands, when they stand side by side and see the same truth, that the entire mental being is satisfied and finds peace. The coming of peace. Some of the wisest of the race, in the older schools of esoteric teaching, have insisted that the only satisfying illumination is that of the illumination of the intellect by the intuition, when the power of intuition is admitted to the intellect and runs freely over its wires and brings the glow to the lamps of reason. Then and then alone comes that satisfying peace, that calm of seeing and rest of feeling, that peace which passeth all understanding. Illumination is the clearing away of the smoke of illusion from the tear-stained eyes of the individual, that he may see what he is in his real self. He then perceives not only that he lives and moves and has his being in spirit, but also that spirit, in its totality of being, lives and moves and has its being in him. Illumination comes gradually to some, instantaneously to others. It comes to no two alike. It calls men and women in the field, the workshop, the kitchen, as well as in the palace or in the parlor. It respects not position nor condition. It ever calls its own to it. When the pupil is ready, the master appears. Wheresoever I go, mine own await me. Wheresoever I pass, mine own know my footsteps and follow me. As a great teacher has said, and the prophecy is this, that those who shall devotedly and sincerely adopt the message of truth, rationally interpreted, must inevitably perceive the truth, realize the truth whereby immortality, satisfaction, and freedom are secured. Nirvana. An authority, speaking for the Buddhist conception of spirit, says, there is a Japanese proverb which says, there are many roads up to the mountain, but it is always the same moon that is seen from the top. The Japanese themselves, with a liberality worthy of imitation, apply this saying to different forms of religious belief. The mountain may well typify matter, and the summit the highest point on which a climber can stand and maintain his separate individual existence in terms of consciousness drawn from the material world. This peak may be accessible by any religion or without any religion, but Buddhism and its genetically associated systems look beyond. The mountain top is the apotheosis of personal existence, the highest form of consciousness that can be expressed in terms of separate individuality, a sublime elevation where many a pilgrim is content to pause. Below him are the kingdoms, above him are the stars. The kingdoms and stars alike are his. But it is not the end. Deeper than the kingdoms and higher than the stars is the sky that holds them all. And there alone is peace, that peace which the material world cannot give, the peace which passeth understanding trained on material things, infinite and eternal peace, the peace of limitless consciousness unified with limitless will. That peace is nirvana, rest for reason. Another authority says, as knowledge and wisdom increase, as our eyes are opened more fully to the eternal verities, as we more fully realize the marvelous wonders of the universe, and as we shall be in better accord, we may finally come to recognize that our consciousness of God is only a part of God's consciousness of Himself. All bodies modes of infinite extension, all souls modes of infinite thought. And as we see more clearly and feel more vividly that we are inherent parts of its glorious unity, we may hope to reach that ultimate real principle of knowledge and being without which there can be no rest for reason, or unity in the universe. A poet of our Western land has voiced this truth forcibly in the following lines: Illusion, by Ella Wheeler Wilcox. God and I in space alone, and nobody else in view. And where are the people, O Lord, I said, the earth below and the sky overhead, and the dead whom once I knew? That was a dream, God smiled and said, a dream that seemed to be true. There were no people living or dead, there was no earth and no sky overhead, there was only myself and you. Why do I feel no fear, I asked, meeting you here in this way? For I have sinned, I know full well. And is the heaven, and is the hell, and is this the judgment day? Nay. Those were dreams, the great God said, dreams that have ceased to be. There is no such thing as fear or sin. There is no you never have been. There is nothing at all but me. Avatars of the Almighty. Harold Bowles, in his series of articles in the Cosmopolitan a year or so ago, said, and now that man has discovered that there resides in his nature a spirit or energy that is divine, the colleges say, and that he can summon it to work his will, the potency and future operations of this force no man can compute. Science has found a way through psychology to guard the opportunities for the race, through invoking in the human consciousness the brooding spirit that fills all space, are absolutely infinite. Science, therefore, is demonstrating along new lines, or at least is claiming to demonstrate, that man is God made manifest. And modern philosophy, as set forth in American universities, holds this incarnation not as a fanciful and merely beautiful ideal, but as a working and understandable principle in the soul of humanity. The professors therefore stand as the exponents of the teaching that man is the embodiment and conscious expression of the force that guides all life and holds all matter in its course. Not merely in religious rhetoric, but in reality, the schoolmen say, is man the avatar of God. Man has begun the cycle of that triumphal daring prophesied by ancient seers, and which appealed so potently to the imagination of Poe, who said, I think that the sense of individual identity will be gradually merged in the general consciousness that man, for example, will at length attain that awfully triumphant epoch when he shall recognize his existence as that of Jehovah. A broken bar. This is not an atheistic banishment of God and his holy angels, but is, on the contrary, the enthronement of a new Jehovah God that has become conscious and potent in the human mind. The promise. Passing on from this consideration, we call your attention to the promise contained in the first lines of the statement given at the beginning of this chapter. Spirit identifies itself with those of its characterizations which demonstrate their ability to consciously identify themselves with it. The importance of this message is at first overlooked by many who read the words. It is really a promise and a message that spirit will identify itself with those who recognize their identity with it. In the degree of the recognition and realization of the identity by the individual, so will spirit identify and manifest itself with and through the individual. As man begins to realize what he really is, he begins to be able to manifest that reality and being through his individual channels of expression. And, accordingly, there begins that conscious manifestation by volition and ideation which constitutes the mastery of being. The mastery of being. When man discovers his identity with spirit, he begins to manifest creation on his own account. No longer a passive instrument, tool, or chessman in the cosmic life. He becomes a center of creative power in himself. It is true that he sees the phenomenal world for what it really is. He sees that prizes and rewards of life are mere baubles and trinkets, and he strives no longer for them for themselves. But, in place of the old illusion, he sees a creative purpose in the cosmic activities, a meaning in the universal becoming, and he smiles and takes his place again on the stage of life, playing his part willingly, cheerfully, confidently, and understandingly. His peep behind the scenes does not interfere with his characterization and the portrayal of his appointed part. On the contrary, he plays his part all the better by reason of his knowing. He loses all fear of death. He fears neither life nor death, neither does he seek death nor avoid it. He seeks neither participation in nor renunciation of life. He simply lives, for to live is the object of life. As the sense of his real nature and being dawn upon him, the sense of his powers begin to manifest in his consciousness. He soon learns that his ideation and volition are real, the same powers with which the universe is created and manifested. He finds that his ideation, when vitalized with his volition, materializes and takes on objective reality. He finds that his ideals tend to become real. He discovers that circumstances, environment, conditions, and states may be created for himself. First the sense of identity and the belief in its power, then the ideative picture in the mind, then the volitional activities of the will, then the objective manifestation. Thus does man become a creator and build for himself a miniature universe with himself as a center. But, and this must always be remembered, man must never allow himself to become entangled in his creations. He must see them always as creations and must never permit himself to become hypnotized by the delusion of their ultimate reality. There is always the danger of taking one's own creations too seriously, just as the world is hypnotized into accepting its own mental creations as realities. The master of being must needs learn to detach himself from his creation, and, figuratively, to stand aside and see himself act and play his part among his creations. Mastery requires the eyes to be kept clear of the stinging smoke of illusion. The master of the show must never allow himself to become carried away by the action of the play, lest he become the victim rather than the victor. These may be strange words to the ears of many, but those whose ears have awakened by the song of life will readily understand them. Parting words. And now, students, friends, and fellow travelers on the path, we come to the time of temporary parting. You will never be the same as you were before you studied this book. You have built the more stately mansions of thought and will continue to build, till thou at length act free, leaving thine outgrown shell by life's unresting sea. You may not have accepted the message, nor have perceived the truth sought to be expressed in these lessons, but the spirit of them will remain with you. For no one who embarks on the quest for truth ever is able to permanently relinquish it nor to forsake the path. He may turn away from it, or seek to retrace his steps, and for a time will seem to have left it behind forever, but sooner or later again will the hunger for knowledge, and the thirst for truth, be felt. Again will the sound of the message penetrate to the ear, and again the pilgrim will resume the path. As Whitman says, my words will itch in your ears till you understand them. Once a truth seeker, always one. Om Mani Padme Hum.